my friends, welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show, and today we're going to talk about mental health diagnoses and our identity. We're going to wrap up May as Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're going to finish with parallels to where we started, 5 action steps that we can do to kind of deal with today's issue. And I'm hopefully in the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to convince you that you are far more than your diagnoses, and it was never meant to be your identity. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show. Hello, my friends. Welcome back. I hope that your week is going well. Wherever your week is, we're done with the month of May. If you're listening to this on the day it comes out, we're done with the month of May. If you're listening to it later, then we're probably definitely done with May, which is wild to me. And today we're finishing up a series that I kind of did on accident called Mental Health Awareness Month. Now, that is not my title, right? Like, obviously somebody else came up with that. But it started at the beginning of May where I talked about like, hey, maybe we need something more than awareness. Maybe we need action. And then we talked about, well, what do we do when we feel stuck? And then we talked about, last week we talked about just still a wild, if you haven't heard that one, go back and listen to it. Still just a wild presupposition to me where a guy comes out and he says, hey, the reason we're not having kids is because of the social media and the phones. That's just wild. And I kind of talked about how crazy I think that is. And now this week we're going to talk about something that is very close and dear to my heart, and that is the reality that your diagnosis was never meant to be your identity. Any diagnosis that you have was never meant to be your identity. It was never meant to be an excuse for poor behavior. It was never meant to be an excuse for abusive behavior. It was never meant to be an excuse for behavior that hurts people. And I realize sometimes we, the people who are living with people with the diagnoses, have to have grace and mercy. And I get that. But today I really want to talk about what happens when you make your diagnosis your identity, and how do we move out from that so that we have a healthier response? Because let's be honest, we live in a world obsessed with labels, right? Anxious. I am anxious. I am ADHD. I am depressed. I am OCD. I am trauma triggered. I am a trauma survivor. I am a narcissist. I am narcissistic. I am bipolar, or he is narcissistic, or she is bipolar. They are autistic, just burned out. And like, we start to run through those things, and everybody's burnout. Like I talked to somebody, they work 30 hours a week on burnout. Okay, well then maybe we need to look at some things and move those forward, right? Attachment styles, well, I just do that because I'm avoidant. I just do that because I'm an anxious attacher. Maybe, but maybe we should improve those behaviors. Maybe we should consider different behaviors. And because the thing is, those diagnoses can be real, and many times they're helpful. They often can explain legitimate struggles that people have had and carried for years without understanding. But, I say this a lot. I'm old enough to remember when we actually debated as a field how helpful is giving the diagnoses to the client. Because, the generation that came before me in therapy, they could see the danger. They could see the danger of when we give the client the diagnoses, that could easily become their identity. And they could see the danger that somewhere along the way, rather than a diagnosis being a tool to help us live better, it would become not just our identity, but part of the fiber of our being, of who we are. Not because the struggle isn't real, not because you shouldn't get over it, right? Or excuse me, not because you should just get over it. I'm not advocating for any of that. And, I know we hear some of that stuff, but we also have to look at sometimes when an explanation becomes our identity, growth often stops. And if we want to have this month of mental health awareness, then I think the ultimate goal should be more than just awareness. It should be, let's talk about growth. And look, diagnosis can be helpful. Let's just start right here, because nuance matters. I say this to my friends, my clients, anybody who will listen. Life is nuanced, and we need to be nuanced in how we approach it. And diagnosis can absolutely help people. Sometimes a diagnosis finally helps people understand years of confusion, right? I'll never forget one time I was talking to a client about the possibility that they had bipolar disorder. They were like, oh, wow, this would actually make a ton of sense. Conversely, though, I did have another client that I thought met all the criteria for MDD, and I decided at the time that I did not think it would be helpful to just tell him. Because sometimes the diagnosis helps people get access to treatment, correct? Right? Like we know this. It can reduce shame. It gives language. And this is one of the big things. It gives language to experiences that people thought nobody else would ever understand. However, it can also be a very debilitating thing because sometimes that's all people see once they hear the diagnoses, when they look in the mirror, is that's who I am. I want to recognize that there are people that have spent their entire lives believing that they were lazy when really they were depressed, believing that they were undisciplined when really they struggled with ADHD. But the flip side of that is true as well. There have been people who have utilized their diagnoses to get out of actual responsibilities. There have been people who have utilized their diagnoses to get out of doing schoolwork because, well, I have ADHD, Mr. Johnson. There's people who thought they were stupid when really they had learning disabilities. My wife is one of these people. When I met her, she thought she was dumb. She had been told she was dumb by her school teachers. Our dean of women at the university where we went, Dr. Carol King, told her that my wife was using test anxiety. This was 30. We've been married 27 years ago. This was 30 years ago when she told her this. Oh, well, you're just making up that you have test anxiety. That's for people who don't study. And it wasn't true at all. My wife dropped out of college. We got married. We went to get married and move on with our lives. And later she decided to go back to school. She realized she had test anxiety. She found a school that went with a narrative approach to school. And it literally changed everything about how she approached school. She now has a master's degree. She's one of the most fantastic therapists that you'll find in the state of Michigan. I mean, it's just one of those things where when you run it out, her understanding, hey, I have some different ways that my brain processes that are outside of the normals, and then it was helpful for her, right? So she had test anxiety. She and my son have a thing called audio dyslexia, where they just kind of move forward on words differently, and that was like very helpful to us when we got that. There are people who thought that they were just fundamentally broken when really they just had some sort of diagnoses. And the metaphor that I like is the diagnosis can be like a flashlight. And flashlights are designed to help you move. They're designed to help you better see. But they're not designed to convince you to sit perfectly still in the dark, right? A flashlight that you don't actually use to see and then move doesn't help you. And that's somewhat the danger with our modern use of diagnoses. A diagnosis should create understanding, and when it's done well, that's what it does. It doesn't eliminate responsibility. In many aspects, a diagnosis should be a turning of the page, not the end of the story, right? We go from confusion or lack of understanding to understanding, to movement, to the possibility of movement, to growth. And when we do that, diagnoses are a beautiful thing. They're a wonderful thing. The stories that we tell ourselves shape how we live our lives, right? What you tell yourself, you become. What you say about yourself, you become. Because when you talk, you hear yourself talk. Right now, as I'm recording this, there's no one else in the room. The only person hearing what I'm saying is me. And if I say I struggle with anxiety, that leaves space for me to create movement. That leaves space for growth. But if I say I am anxious, that creates identity. If I say I am anxious, the unspoken part, and sometimes spoken out loud, is that's just who I am. And when we do that, something moves psychologically in our brain, and it is like a vice trapped around our feet. We no longer move. Now the anxiety is no longer an experience. It's my personality. It's a permanent identity. It's a lens through which everything gets interpreted. And I see this even with physical diagnoses, right? I see people get some very serious physical diagnoses, maybe not fatal, but ones that just upend their lives. And invariably, the ones who create more movement in their lives, the ones who respond in a more healthy manner, they don't make it their identity. They make it an experience. They make it something they're living through. Because as humans, we protect our identities fiercely, even unhealthy ones. We don't care. We are just hardwired to protect our identities. That's one of the reasons that change becomes so difficult for so many people. It's not because that they're incapable of change. It's not because they can't change. Change becomes so difficult for them because they've made it their identity, and it becomes their community. They find other people who also have the diagnosis as their identity, and it becomes their social currency, online and in person. Sometimes they actually create explanations for every conflict, every failure, every unhealthy behavior from their diagnoses. And I want to make sure you hear this. Understanding yourself is good. I need you to hear that really clearly. Understanding yourself is really good. And it needs to be movement forward, because understanding ourselves can't be the movement we take to become our identity. Our identity has to be about more than our diagnoses, because over-identifying with your pain will trap you inside of it. Your pain, your identity, your diagnosis, when that all gets morphed into one, you become trapped inside of it. And you almost start to wonder, and I've sat with people and they've literally said this to me, I don't know if getting healthy is worth the risk. And here's the thing, if you listen to last week and if you heard me talk, and sometimes people have said, like last week I mentioned, when I talk about social media, sometimes I feel like I'm back in the old conversations about spanking. The minute I say I don't think social media is bad, I don't think it's the cause, I think it's a symptom, people are like, oh, so you just kind of let everything go willy-nilly? No, that isn't what I'm saying. Because here's the thing, I actually do believe that social media has made this worse. I actually believe that social media has accelerated this adaption of our identity, of our diagnoses and our ailments as identity. I do. I think it started with TV and entertainment, and when we made ailments entertainment, when we made ailments, characters in movies, rather than just building a character or everything, we made them bigger than life. And so people started chasing diagnoses. And you see this in schools a lot. You see this. My friends that work in schools tell me this all the time. They have kids that are chasing some sort of diagnosis so they can be with their friends, so they can feel like they're normals. And think about it. You'll see posts like this, and I've posted some of these, and I don't think they're completely bad, but I do think there needs to be caution with them, right? It's like a vehicle's a great tool, but it can also be used to hurt people. Here's some things you might hear from people that see their diagnosis as identity. Here are 14 signs you're dealing with untreated trauma. Things only ADHD people understand. If you do these 5 things, you're definitely avoidant attached, which is not even how you would word it. Your ex wasn't selfish. They were a narcissist. These are real titles that I went and found, okay? Because here's the thing that terrifies me about this. Some of these contain truth, but a lot of it turns deeply complex human experiences into oversimplified categories. And when we do that, people start interpreting their whole lives through diagnostic language. And it just doesn't work. Every conflict is trauma. Every disagreement is trauma. And if everything's traumatic, nothing's traumatic. And that just fires people up. Every uncomfortable emotion becomes pathology. And eventually people stop asking, what can I do next? And they start saying, what label explains me? Well, that label right there, that's the one that explains me. And this is a dangerous movement. This is dangerous because when we explain things without movement, we stagnate. And when we stagnate, we fail to grow. And anything in life that stagnates rots. It dies and it rots. I don't know how else to say that. It just does. And the hard part is pain is real. And I've talked about this a lot the last few months, but so is your agency to operate even with pain. I don't ever want somebody to say, oh, so you're saying mental illness isn't real? Of course not. Of course I'm not saying that. I am literally devoting most of my adult life to helping people with mental illness. Depression is real. Trauma is real. Anxiety is real. ADHD, addiction, they're all real. But your struggle being real doesn't mean it gets to become the ruler of your life. And one of the cruelest things we can do to people is convince them that they are powerless against their diagnoses and their circumstances. Because now the diagnosis stops being about gaining information and learning how to grow, and it becomes destiny. It becomes this thing that they can't overcome. That's just dressing up hopelessness in clinical language. And that is no help. There's a really big difference between this affects me and this defines me. The one, it just automatically leaves room for growth. The other says, nope, this is who I am and there's nothing else that I can do. It's resignation. And you'll see this even this is probably a whole separate episode, but you'll see this with people who have gone through really deep grief things. Someone who lost a spouse, car wreck, death, any of those. You'll see people who have medically complex children, people who have gone through a life-altering accident as an adult. Maybe they went from being able to walk to confined to a wheelchair. And there's a lot of research on this, that you can track the language of how they post. The unhealthy people always post about themselves. The unhealthy people always post about how it only affects them. The healthy people talk about what they experienced and what they hope to do with that experience for other people, how they want to help other people with that experience, how they want to lead other people to growth. And it's fascinating study. I'm probably going to do an episode on that. Sometimes I hesitate to say that I'm going to do an episode because sometimes the idea literally comes to me while I'm recording this, and I don't write it down into my slush fund of ideas, and then I never come back to it. And one of you listens and you send me a text or an email, or you reach out to me and you're like, hey, what about this episode? I'm like, oh, crap. And so that's no good. So I haven't written that down, so I'm just going to say maybe. Longtime listeners won't be surprised by this next segment because I've said it before. I think what happened was in society, we overcorrected them. We had this giant pendulum swing where over here we had the generation before us that didn't talk about emotions at all. Everything was just rub dirt on it and get rah, rah, rah. Right? But now we've come so far the other way that we've overstated it. And I started with this idea this month, and I'm going to end this month with this idea. Because for years, mental health was ignored. People mocked it. They hid it because it was mocked. And it was stigmatized. Let's just be honest about that. People were told, well, you just got to pray harder. Just trust God more. Man up. Get over it. I always love the ones that appeal to my testosterone. In fact, now that I'm old, probably when I was younger, that would sometimes incite me. Now I'll just look at people and be like, oh yeah, appeal to my testosterone. That'll probably move me. And you'll hear this one, stop being dramatic. And the problem is, there are people that need to stop being dramatic. But by and large, that generation's use of that was harmful. But now we've swung so far the other direction that sometimes struggle itself becomes sacred. It's literally like, if there's not something wrong with you, is there something wrong with you? You're not allowed to be like, no, I'm okay. Or yeah, you know what? I went through this and it was really hard, but I'm moving forward. And again, I'm gonna finish the month with this. Awareness matters, but awareness alone won't actually change anything. It's like looking in a mirror and not doing anything. This afternoon, I had to run home in between recording some of these episodes, and I made myself a protein shake for lunch because it's quick, and I dripped some chocolate on my hoodie. And my daughter's like, hey, I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna leave it because I'm gonna go home and do some work outside. And I'm not using the hoodie to record this, so you can't see it. But if I did reuse the hoodie, right, or if I had some chocolate on my face, and you're watching this on YouTube, you'd be like, that fool has chocolate on his face. And when we do this, what happens is sometimes healing gets replaced with self-protection. And the self-protection is protecting the identity of the diagnosis, not protecting the person. Self-awareness alone is not growth. It's a growth activity. It's like going to the gym and working out a little bit. But being able to recognize that there's something going on inside of you without doing something about it isn't growth. And when we do that, what happens is we take labels and they become excuses to never confront hard things, or to rarely confront hard things, or to half-heartedly confront hard things. And that doesn't help us because awareness matters. I've said this already about 9 times, but awareness alone won't change your life. You can deeply understand your patterns that are destructive. You can deeply understand what's going on with you, the things that are unique to you because of your diagnoses, because of whatever's going on. But you can still remain trapped in them if that's all the further you take it. Insight is valuable, but movement transforms. And think about it. We've even taken to the point where we've tried to make the labels sexy, right? We've gone from neurodivergent, rather than just saying somebody's autistic, they have ADHD or whatever, right? They're on the spectrum, saying something like that. We've moved to, well, I'm neurospicy. And it's goofy because what we're doing is we're trapping people. People aren't allowed to say, yes, I'm on the spectrum and I struggle to pick up on social cues. So you might have to tell me so that I can move forward. Joe, you're shaming them. No, I'm not. I cannot tell you how many people have sat in my room and said, I just wish people would help me pick up on cues. I'll say it one last time. Insight is valuable, but motivation or movement transforms. Insight has value. Movement transforms, and that's the goal. One of the things that has become, I think, an unintended consequence of this is people tend to shrink their life down to their worst day. They shrink their life down to their most weak and vulnerable spot. You're not merely your anxiety. You're not merely your depression. You're not merely your trauma or whoever hurt you. You're not merely your addiction. You're not merely your diagnosis. You're a full person. You are a whole person who has things that they have to wrestle with that maybe not everyone else has. But those other people probably have things they wrestle with that you don't. You still have agency. You still have responsibility. You still have value. You still have choices. You still have the capacity to grow and impact others. It won't be perfect. Probably won't be quick. And you might not be able to do it without help. But you still, as a full person, have the possibility of growth. And that matters. And what happens is we diminish that when we make our diagnoses our identity. Let's talk about a few quick action steps before we wrap this up today. But what do we do with this, right? That's a fair question. I think the first thing is you use your diagnoses as information, not identity. You use it as information, not identity. A diagnosis can help you understand patterns of your life. It should not become the total definition of who you are. Number 2, don't use permanent language for every struggle. Be careful with phrases like, that's just how I am. This is who I've always been. I can't help it. And be careful with the people in your life that use those phrases. Correct them out loud. No, this isn't who I always am. These statements give us a false sense of protection. Really, they're usually just prisons. They're just things that trap us, as surely as though you were trapped inside a prison. Number 3, focus on movement, not perfection. You're going to notice some parallels between this one and the one that opened the month. Healing, I hate universals, so I won't say it's never linear, but man, it's rarely linear. And growth is almost always messy. But movement matters. If you had sexual abuse as a child, and now you don't want to have regular healthy sex with your spouse, engaging in that's going to be hard. But if you don't, you're trapped by something that someone did to you when you were 12 or 7 or 8 or 16 or whenever. Small, consistent actions are what changes. So do what you can to move that way. If you have an addiction, it's going to be a hard battle, but you can beat it. We have plenty of evidence to prove that. Number 4, curate your intakes and your whole thing. Curate what goes into your brain. Some mental health content on the internet is good. Talking to people about your mental health is good. Talking with people about their mental health is good. But be careful. There is this really weird thing that I can talk to them because they went through the same thing. Maybe, but that doesn't mean they're healed. And I'm super concerned. We did an internship thing just recently, trying to recruit interns for future years. And I was talking to somebody who's doing her studies, her PhD thesis on church counseling. And I said to her, and hopefully why it should stop, because a lot of those people have zero training. They have zero skills in actually doing training. And what happens, or in actually doing counseling. And so what happens when they do the counseling, they do bad things. They hurt people. And so you need to be careful who you're taking intakes from. There's churches that form groups that they don't really have any training, and they go meet with people. And I get it. There are times that this is a good alternative because people can't get into counseling and all the things. But you need to be careful about the intakes that you're taking in. Everything you hear, you need to kind of run through a filter of, is this helping me grow or is it slowing my growth down? Even from people who want to help you. I want to be clear, I'm not even questioning their motives. I think there's a lot of people who genuinely want to help people who shouldn't be. Even the things you hear from a counselor, you should question. Number 5, remember that explanation and responsibility can coexist. In other words, remember, you can have a diagnosis and it can make total sense. You have a temper because you were abused as a kid, and that's one of the ways your body decided to protect itself. That makes sense. You also have the responsibility to control that temper and not hurt your wife and your children or your husband and your children. Understanding is not the same thing as surrendering. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when people get the diagnoses, now they have understanding, so they surrender to the diagnosis as some sort of permanent behavior. Makes zero sense to me. Okay, so as we wrap up this episode and we wrap up the month of mental health awareness, I think one of the most important things that we can remember is this. Awareness was never supposed to be the end of the conversation. It was just supposed to be the beginning. It was just supposed to invite more people to the table so that we could all sit down together and talk. Your diagnosis might explain parts of your story. It might. In fact, it probably does. But the goal was never, now I finally have a label. The goal was always, now that you understand what you're dealing with, here's how we can move forward wisely. Your diagnosis can explain some of the battles you fight. It can explain why some things are harder for you than they are for others, or some things are harder for others than they are for you. But it was never meant to become our identity. It was never meant to become the thing that defined us, because human beings are always more than their wounds. They're always more than their symptoms. They are always more than their hardest moments. And maybe one of the healthiest things that we can say is, this is something I deal with, without accidentally turning it into, this is all I am. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this month. I hope you're enjoying the episodes. If you are, would you be willing to share this with your friends? Just hit share. If you found it on social media, just hit share. If you haven't found it on social media and you're listening to it through whatever, you can find me on Facebook. My account is just pretty much wide open to the public. Feel free to go right there on Wednesday, the 27th, and just absolutely drop this out there for the world to see. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.